And welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. I'm blessed to be joined by someone I consider a dear friend, a long-time friend. We've known each other, James, it's been 10 years. Dr. James Patterson, Associate Professor in the Institute of American Civics at the University of Tennessee.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's been 10 years. I've aged. You haven't. What's the secret?
I have a very, very wonderful wife who's insulated me from the trials of academia. But it's very nice of you to overlook all the weight I've gained.
Well, it's nice of you to overlook. Okay, so James, we have very little time, and I want to make sure that our audience can glean from your wisdom here. Now, you and I have spoken in the past about a lot of topics, but one of the things that funnily enough, in this past year, so many people who ascribe to these movements have come to find me because I don't ascribe to the movement myself. And these are the post-liberals and especially the Catholic integralists. And, some of my theologian friends who have identified as wanting a Catholic theonomic order or theocratic order. And I know you're seeing it too. So, broad strokes, I just want you to speak about it, share with our listeners what's going on in that movement, but also why we don't actually want that.
Okay, so that's a big question, and I've recently published a book with my co-author, Thomas Howes, called Why Post-Liberalism Failed, where we talk about it in a lot more detail, but let's just do the easy version here. So Catholic integralism is the idea that you would have a indirect temporal authority of the papacy over your government. So the papacy would essentially have a kind of veto power or directorial power over what integralists call temporal power. So that would refer to, in their view, the president, because generally speaking, integralists are not favorable to electoral government. They want crowns, they want kings. So you would have a revision of the Constitution. Gladden Papin, one of them, actually even hoped that Melania would become empress. This is sort of like a silly thing in a way, but these people are, have a lot of access to political power in the form of their friends like J.D. Vance. And Papin himself used to work for Viktor Orban in Hungary, so, a head of state that only just recently lost. So what they want is for the establishment of a Catholic regime. Catholics hear this and they're like, oh, that's good. But
they're sounds great on paper, right?
Yeah, but their version of Catholicism is a bit more authoritarian.
Yes.
So they want, for example, to define citizenship as baptism, and it has to be a licit baptism under church teaching. And if you're baptized and not Catholic, so if you're Orthodox or Protestant, you're subject to serious temporal punishments for which there's no appeal. And if you're unbaptized, then you have no rights whatsoever. And, at one point on social media, you had a leading theorist, Father Edmund Waldstein, supporting, at least in principle, the idea of Jewish ghettos. And this is all, and especially in the case of Father Waldstein, who is, by all accounts, a lovely person.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, we both know him.
Yeah, we both know him and his
That breaks
parents.
my heart.
Yeah, it's just shows that, there's a disconnect between what they think is possible and the legacy of those attempts and how terrible they were for the church.
Can we acknowledge that?
Yeah.
Have these people not cracked history books?
Yeah, I mean, it is troubling. As I explain in the book, one of their big sort of papal claims that's really important to them is unum sanctum, which is Boniface VIII. He makes this in response to the French king taxing the church, which they should not have done, let's be clear. But the outcome of this is that he claims universal suzerainty of all of Christendom to the Pope, and Philip the Fair shows up in the Vatican, kidnaps him, and then Boniface VIII dies, and thus begins the Babylonian captivity. We've seen this over and over again where church leaders have attempted to intervene too directly into temporal affairs, and the outcome has been both harms to the church, especially the Pope himself definitely didn't deserve to die.
Yep.
But also fractures within the church. Right, the Babylonian captivity in medieval history is one of the worst moments in Catholic history, bar none. And so this time will be different is not a persuasive argument.
No, not by any stretch of the imagination.
Yeah.
And so you already brought up a few figures whose names are thrown around the post-liberalism and integralist conversation. And I just want to bring out these names just so that you can help our listeners understand what's going on here. So Vance, J.D. Vance,
J.D.
is-
Vance,
is
yeah.
practically the poster boy of what was supposed to be a kind of Catholic integralism, but
Yeah.
I don't know. Some of his moral positions makes me question how much influence they have. But that's debate for another.
I joke about that being a post-liberal taqiyya, which is like and yeah, the Shia Muslims used to pretend to be Sunni, so they would avoid like
That's
mass slaughter or arrests. So he's pretending to be a bad Catholic until he becomes president, and then
and then
there's no way to. That's a joke, by the way.
no. If that happens, I'll buy you a sandwich. So we've got Vance, we've got Deneen. You mentioned Papin earlier. These are some of the bigger names at play. Just very briefly, share with us what's going on and the kind of political power they have.
Yeah, it's I think a big story that doesn't get a lot of attention. So, Gladden Papin was the president of the Hungarian Institute of International Affairs, which was a directly funded state operation by Viktor Orban out of Hungary. And Orban dedicated a tremendous amount of resources to creating connections to American conservative movements. And so, through things like the Danube Institute, Matthias Corvinus Collegium, and, Papin's own organization, they would form these official or informal coalitions, and then they would spread those kinds of connections into other right-wing parties like Vox in Spain. So like the Danube Institute connects to Heritage, and then the president of Heritage goes to Spain to speak to Vox. Sorry if this is starting to sound a little complicated, but it just shows you how, like, with just a little bit of resources and entrepreneurship, you can create
And networking,
Yeah, and of course, there's a lot of appetites for this in the United States, because one of the things I think people may not know about being a conservative academic is that it's not an easy gig. You don't get a lot of prestige or money. It's not like you have the Ford Foundation who's going to hand you millions of dollars. And so if you have, the Danube Institute in Hungary send you $20,000 in a first-class plane ticket, that's like the most recognition you've ever had for your work in your life most of the time. And so it was very easy to recruit some of the best people to get involved in this sort of thing. And this was supposed to translate into a kind of political support for national conservative, post-liberal, sort of on that sort of spectrum. And Vance was definitely one of the key figures they were looking to. Now, because of Orban's defeat, there's a kind of resettling of people that were operating through there. For example, the Intercollegiate Studies Institute has a new president that they're going to select. So you might see Papin or a guy named Nathan Pekoski taking over. But these are also very serious people, right? That's the other thing. It's like, I don't mean to make them sound like mercenaries. Like Patrick Deneen is an incredibly good political philosopher out of Notre Dame. Adrian Vermeule is a administrative law professor at Harvard Law School, right? So one of the reasons why they have this kind of political access and authority is that they're at prestigious institutions and are themselves, serious people. So I think often because the beliefs that they profess are so weird or so unfamiliar to Americans, they're discounted. But you've got a chaired professor at Harvard Law School, you can't dismiss the ideas.
That's right. That's right. These are people with copious influence. Now, we've got about, say, under a minute left in this segment. I want to ask you to just very briefly speak to, and we'll continue on the other side of the break, why this is an issue that Catholics need to be aware of.
Well, it's got a lot of traction with younger Catholics, and we're now at the point where this stuff's been around for 10 years. And that means people who maybe were into Catholic integralism will have finished seminary and will be achieving their first appointments in the church or in their religious orders. Now, there is something to be said about this being a youthful enthusiasm that dissipates over time. Like
one would hope.
Yeah, it's one thing to want to like restore the papal states when you're in seminary. It's a whole other thing when you have to balance the budget at a parish. It's like I don't know. I don't know if I can retake any.
Crusade is useful until you look at the checkbook. Yes,
that's right. We're not retaking much with these donations, but the ideas themselves are a tremendous waste. Like you could actually raise people in authentic Catholic social teaching, which is not Catholic integralism. So that's one problem. The other problem...
We have to pause there.
Oh.
You can bring up on the other side of the break.
Yeah, my bad,
I'm
say.
talking with Dr. James Patterson. He's a dear friend, now associate professor in the Institute of American Civics at the University of Tennessee. And we're talking about this concept of, well, essentially a Catholic state governance, Catholic integralism, and or integralism, and why Catholics don't really want that. Continuing on the other side, stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peter. And welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter talking with Dr. James Patterson, dear friend, associate professor in the Institute of American Civics at the University of Tennessee. Now, James, you were presenting us one reason why Catholics not only need to be aware, but we want to be wary of this. What was the second reason?
The second reason is that this is not good, okay? Like, this stuff has gotten...
It's as clear.
It's just... Let me just make it clear. Like, you know, Archbishop Cordileone of San Francisco, he, like, writes a foreword to our book talking about the real problems with this, right? He's not going to, like... He's not trying to, like, take sides in the debate, right? That's not what he's trying to do. But he wants to express real concern about this stuff happening. Of course, the outgoing apostolic nuncio, Cardinal Pierre, was, you know, last year talking about how, for him, post-liberalism or Catholic integralism really is a kind of Catholic wokeness.
Yes.
And, you know, follows from the same kind of identity politics problems that the church does not endorse.
Just to shed a little more light on that, it's because it's applying that same critical social lens to everything that's happening and saying, break all of this down, this is the system we need.
That's right. It's a radical revolutionary ideology in the same way that wokeness is. So rather than it being identity based around race or ethnicity, it's based around a kind of Catholic identity, which is not in itself based around, and sufficiently, at least in its ideas, around like conversion, right, or Christ. It's really much more about power. And then, you know, so these are not insignificant figures, right? We have, you know, a prince of the church and a leading conservative archbishop expressing real reservations about these sorts of things. And it's because it's just not good teaching.
Yep. And therefore, how ought Catholics... We had the 250th anniversary of the founding of this great nation. And I say that in no uncertain terms, this great nation. As an immigrant, as someone who's lived in 6 different countries before, I can say this firsthand. But also just... The study of the document shows that there's so much that's an overflow from the entire Catholic intellectual patrimony and even Catholic social doctrine that allows for, that these documents allow for the flourishing of that in this nation. So how should Catholics think about their role, say, in the United States right now?
Well, I'm going to jump the gun a little bit and call him Blessed Archbishop Fulton J. Sheen. I know we haven't officially done but I'm a huge fan, so I've been wanting to call him that for a long time. So the second the word came out, I was going to... He refers to the Declaration of Independence as to the truth of the gospel in government. So he says, God founds governments on account of men and died on the cross on account of them. And so the reason why he says that is that the Declaration puts the government in service to persons. Right, Christ died on the cross in service to us. And so this sort of mirroring of the government being in service to us is what the Declaration calls for. The Declaration, of course, is not directly citing like Bellarmine, you know, and it was primarily a Protestant revolution. This is, you know, we only have one Catholic signer, Charles Carroll of Carrollton. But one of the fruits of America's independence is that Catholics get a bishop, right? They get a bishop and an archbishop in his cousin, John Carroll, right? And as John Courtney Murray points out, it was the first time the church had the independent authority to appoint a bishop in hundreds of years, right? You know, in Europe, especially in France and the Holy Roman Empire, you know, the
heads of state, the princess, yeah,
thank you. They did a lot to interfere in the United States. Like they ask, of all people, Benjamin Franklin, right? You know, they're like, "Who do you want?" And he's like, "I don't know. Isn't this your job?" You know, so you got Libertas Ecclesia and the unlikeliest of places, but you know, that's an incredible recovery of an ancient church liberty. In a Protestant country. It really is a providential occasion that we became an independent nation this way.
Yeah, and therefore, I want to just shift gears mildly. I know we only have 7 minutes to do this, but this term fusionism now is showing up in terms of as a philosophical flaw. Personally, I don't know if political fusionism has as much of a hold today, or is regaining a hold. At least from a philosophical perspective, it definitely is showing up. So, what is fusionism? And it has nothing to do with atoms and molecules.
That's right. That's right. If only, free energy. But instead, what we're talking about is an older conservative political philosophy that was emphatically pro-American and pro-market and pro-religion. So older Americans might actually just sort of take this idea for granted. Younger Americans might think that it's crazy. But the ideas really surfaced during the mid to late 20th century with people like William F. Buckley Jr.,
Francis Meyer.
Right, Frank Meyer, who we'll be talking about today, and the hope was that National Review, this magazine, would be like the chief organ of its ideas. And what you're fusing are two sort of separate ideological systems that can't be ultimately made into one thing, right? So you're fusing them, but they're never the same. And that is, on the one hand, a preference for individual liberty against external pressure, and that's liberalism. Not in a kind of left-wing style, but in a right-wing style. And the other is tradition. So this would be Catholic social teaching, also sort of a Protestant tradition of these sorts of things, and Jewish rabbinical traditions, and their internal dialogues, and where they have a consensus, and trying to figure out what is the proper orientation around individual liberty, what are the proper ends, and Catholics contributed tremendously to this way of understanding. I already mentioned Murray, but Father John Newhouse, and Fulton Sheen himself later in life, who actually goes on Buckley's show, Firing Line, and one of the more astonishing feats of his life. If you can actually see it on YouTube, he's kind of lost a step, but it's a really great example of like the older sort of a Thomistic revival that Sheen embraced, and the newer sort of fusionism. There's a kind of passing of the baton. Now, the reason this is important is that this was the model of conservatism that reigned from the 1950s until, I would say, the election of Donald Trump. And Donald Trump's sort of Make America Great Again, MAGA sort of ideology has never really coalesced.
Yep.
That's because it's much more about a person than a set of principles. And so what you've had instead of fusionism are efforts to reimagine MAGA in terms that work for the people making that argument. So post-liberalism is one of these.
Yep.
Where like MAGA is going to become what we say it is, and that's why they get behind Vance, because he will be the next person.
Right. And largely it's because you have to think about, in this case, the Republican Party post-Trump.
Right.
Because, terms of office, but also the man's not going to be around forever.
That's right. And so you need to have ideas in service to a person. Now, in a way, fusionism kind of did this with Reagan, but it always operated independently of political leaders, because the closer you tie your ideas to the fate of a political figure, the more likely it is that that person's going to fail you, and then your ideas will fail as well. And so fusionism becomes a way of thinking about the need to reduce government interventions, reduce government taxation, empower individuals and communities to use those resources to improve themselves at the local level, and to recover constitutional liberties that the federal government had usurped. So classically, some of the things that they wanted to do were to end Roe versus Wade, that we can check that, as well as strengthen the United States military so that we could be able to confront two threats at the same time. This is an uncomfortable position for even some people in fusionism, because the United States really never sought to become a world policeman, right? But unfortunately, this sort of mantle fell on us.
Yeah, exactly.
And then lastly, you have a desire to recover a kind of religious foundation for the American Constitution, which, without a religious foundation really struggles to make sense.
Yep,
exactly. Why do we have these things in the preamble of the Constitution, right? The common welfare, the common defense or the general welfare. These things often in contemporary jurisprudence just get tossed to the side because they're considered just ornaments.
Yeah, holdovers from a religious time.
Exactly, but the religious basis for this is that governments are not just constrained by the text of the Constitution, but by the ends.
Exactly. That we are accountable to nature and nature's God.
Yes, that's right, which is exactly where those ends come from. And the idea of nature and nature's God is meant to make the religious foundation as open to a pluralistic society. I mean, already by 1776, you have Congregationalists, Baptists, Unitarians, Anglicans, Catholics, and Jews, and Quakers.
That's right.
So, you know, you're not going to appeal. Obviously, if you're an Anglican, you can't appeal to the king anymore. Right? So instead, they appeal to nature, and this is an open source of authority that doesn't need to be denominational, because a lot of the things we're talking about, you know, they aren't sourced by revelation. So the idea that a person has an inalienable right to conscience is something we can know by nature.
Yes.
You know, I can't ask my governor to go get baptized on my baby's behalf, right? That would not make sense.
Yeah.
And that means that you can't delegate that authority, and so you can't delegate.
I was wondering where you were going with that.
Yeah. I mean, you know, the baby's not baptized, right? It needs to be physically done to the baby by the consent of the parents.
Yeah.
And because the sheriff can't be baptized on your baby's behalf, this is an illustration of how that's not delegated.
Yep.
And that's something you don't necessarily need the magisterium to teach you, although it's good that it does.
Yep,
You know?
and praise the Lord that we have that central authority to give us this orienting, illuminating principle. We have under a minute.
Yeah.
Just very quickly, James, if people want to find out more about how to think rightly about all these issues and follow your work.
Okay, so I do a podcast at Law and Liberty. So I do that every other week. I do an occasional podcast on YouTube as well, which can be found on other podcast sites called Why Post-Liberalism Failed. My most recent book came out with Tom Howes a few days ago, so, you know, buy that. I think the e-version is actually $3. We had someone, you know, I just sold one of these right before I came on. And I'm also on Twitter at McGill Patterson, although I'm trying not to tweet as much. You know, I got it's.
You don't want to poke the bear as much?
I poked the bear too much.
My guest has been a dear friend, Dr. James Patterson. I love reconnecting with him, Associate Professor in the Institute of American Civics at the University of Tennessee. And we started off talking about these questions of post-liberalism and integralism and why it's important that the everyday American citizen know these terms and understand why they matter to us. And then we started talking about this new, well, it's not so much new, but there's a resurgence in the philosophy of fusionism and why that matters. Stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peter.